Dr. Roberts, it's so nice to meet you. My name is Danielle Boaz. I'm a professor of Africana Studies at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. And my research focuses on the persecution, the prosecution of African diaspora religions, kind of from the beginning of the arrival of people of African descent in the Americas, all the way up through the present day. I have a background, a PhD in history, as well as a Juris Doctor, and I am a licensed attorney in North Carolina and Charlotte. I also am the co-editor in chief of the Journal of Africana Religions, and I am part of a group of devotees and activists called the Working Group on Race, Justice, and Africana Religions, that we're working together across religious traditions and across national boundaries to talk about how we can promote the religious freedom for devotees of African diaspora religions and reduce the violence and discrimination that devotees are experiencing today.
It's good to meet you again, Dr. Boaz. My name is Kodi Roberts. I'm the Associate Professor of History at Louisiana State University. My research interests in general look at the overlap between race and religion. My earliest work looked at the relationship between the groups of African Americans responsible for Plessy versus Ferguson and their parallel quest to stop the segregation of Catholic churches in New Orleans. I then moved on to studying voodoo in New Orleans, mostly in the late 19th century and early 20th, going up till the end of the Great Depression. My current research is on religious education in prisons, focusing mostly on Angola, the Louisiana State Prison here in the most incarcerated state in the nation, trying to unravel the relationship between race and religion and the state is where I spend most of my time.
And I know our works intersect very much in that way. I definitely also am looking at this question of race, religion, and state.
So let's start out with definitions, right? One of the largest problems I had was trying to define voodoo. What is voodoo when you're talking about practitioners, especially in the US in the late 19th and early 20th century? And a lot of your work spans a broader, both geographic and ideological milieu. So how do you define African diaspora religions?
That's a great question. And I think it's something that probably most of the people who are listening to this, watching this, are probably also going to be unfamiliar with that. So I'm happy that we can start here. African diaspora religions are something that we use a lot of names for. In the scholarly world, we use these terms that a lot of people don't necessarily use in their day to day life. And so these are religions that we're either calling African diaspora religions, sometimes maybe African derived religions, African inspired religions. With African diaspora and these other terms that I mentioned, we're going to be talking about religions that by and large started to develop in the Americas with the trafficking of enslaved Africans to the Americas during the Atlantic slave trade. And then these religions developed over time, and they're so vastly different. I mean, we have to remember that people are coming from all over the African continent, from the upper regions all the way down the Western coast, and they're bringing with them very different religious practices and beliefs. And these practices and beliefs are sometimes not only being fused together with the beliefs and practices of other ethnic groups, but also sometimes mixing with European beliefs and practices, sometimes mixing with indigenous, Native American beliefs and practices. And all of these things are coming together to form what we call African diaspora religions. So these are religions in the Americas that have a large portion of their roots in Africa, or are perceived at least to have a large portion of their roots in Africa. But they may have a lot of other influences, a lot of other things going on, and the religions can change and evolve over time. And in fact, they very much did. And then these are within an umbrella of religions that we'd refer to as Africana religions. And Africana is just a quick, concise term that we use to refer to things that involve the African continent and the African diaspora. So, religions in Africa in this case, and religions that are derived or partially derived from African religions, but are developing in other parts of the world, especially the Americas. So, in theory, that's what we mean, right? But you asked about this terminology of voodoo, and I think that this is going to form a large part of our conversation today because our beliefs, our understandings of voodoo are so shaped by misconceptions, so shaped by, I would argue, racism, years of misunderstanding, sometimes intentional, right? And so, one of the things that I think it's important to talk about, important to know, is that these terms that are given to African diaspora religions, so things like voodoo, obia, they weren't necessarily terms that African people were using to talk about their own religions when they arrived in the Americas. These were typically African terms in some way, shape, or form. They might refer to something like a spirit or a particular kind of spiritual practitioner, but there aren't umbrella terms the way that Christians would refer to their religion as Christianity or something like that. They are terms that Europeans picked up on and said, hey, wait a minute, these terms are a neat way for us to refer to these religions entirely, no matter where they're coming from, what ethnic group is most influencing them. And so terms like voodoo, terms like obia, they come about to refer to a broad spectrum of religious practices, of which the degree to which they're actually coming from Africa can vary quite a lot. Europeans are also making a lot of assumptions because they're not on the ground there and they're not, at this stage at least, often directly involved in African spiritual practices in these communities themselves. And so they're imposing these ideas about what these religions are made up of, about who people are worshiping and how they're going about it and what certain practices mean. And some of the things that we start to see are things like assumptions that people are worshiping the devil. Europeans at the time that they were colonizing the Americas still largely believed that any supernatural power that didn't come from God, from their Christian God, came from the devil. And so there's this idea that if people were practicing with power that came from the devil, that they were actually practicing a kind of witchcraft or sorcery. And so a lot of these myths, a lot of these misconceptions that we have of African diaspora religions can date way back to slavery, way back to the colonization of the Americas, and to some extent the colonization of Africa, because these two things are not exactly separate. Europeans are developing all these assumptions based on their own worldviews of what Africans are doing, and they're casting them as devil worshippers and people who are attempting to practice witchcraft and sorcery. And I think a great example of that is the common misconception that these voodoo dolls are a part of African spirituality. I mean, there are certain human-like representations that are a part of some African diaspora religions, but the concept that we have of voodoo dolls is these little dolls that represent a particular person that you're sticking pins and needles into or doing other bad things to the doll with the hope that it happens to that person. This is a part of European concepts of witchcraft, which I've read about being referred to as image magic. This is something that Europeans imposed on voodoo. It was their understanding of how people were harming others. And then over time, this just became part of our common parlance about, oh, this is an African practice. This is where it's coming from. And the funny thing is that it's not at all.
Yeah,
Right.
we have a huge problem trying to define these kinds of terms, especially for New Orleans at the period that I study. A lot of the issue, part of the issue is historical, part of the issue is racial, right? So there's a kind of intrinsic anti-Blackness during the Jim Crow period. where folks are very comfortable demonizing anything that looks like African American culture or anything that African Americans are doing, and slapping that label voodoo on anything that's a little too Black for them to be comfortable. So that's part of the issue we have with definitions. The other issue is legal and historical, right? The earliest accounts of voodoo in New Orleans date all the way back to the French colonial period, when practicing any religion other than Roman Catholicism under what the French call the Code Noir is actually illegal. And so the notion that anybody who's practicing voodoo would tell you what they're doing is in and of itself problematic, because they're admitting to a crime. And so you don't get those kinds of descriptions there. You also have the issue that as you move into the American period in the 19th century, Americans are much less comfortable criminalizing religion, at least explicitly. And so you get these laws against the gathering of African Americans, and whether they be free people of color or enslaved people, and those people gathering with white people. And so voodoo practitioners are frequently prosecuted for illegal gatherings, interracial gatherings. And so again, it becomes difficult to know what is voodoo as understood by practitioners, because they aren't defining voodoo, right? Any account of voodoo is coming from either law enforcement or from media that is covering law enforcement against voodoo practitioners. And so it's very hard to get a definition of voodoo as understood by practitioners until the early 20th century, when the Works Progress Administration comes in and starts interviewing practitioners. So you actually get their understanding of what they're doing in their own words. And that bears very little resemblance to the descriptions you get in the 19th century.
Dr. Roberts, I think you bring up a really good point in speaking about the Code Noir and these restrictions on any other type of religion aside from Catholicism. I mean, this is something that a lot of people don't realize that we see throughout the Americas during the period of colonization, the period of slavery, particularly in Catholic colonies. We see laws like the Code Noir that are saying you can't practice anything other than Catholicism. There are also, just throughout the Americas, a lot of restrictions that come up on gathering of enslaved people, what they can do when they gather together. And all of these restrictions are designed to essentially prevent one thing, which is slave rebellions, right? And particularly, I would say, starting around the 18th century, around the 1750s, 1760s, what we see also is some direct prohibitions on African diaspora religions, particularly Obeah in the British Caribbean, that after the priests of some African religions are offering protections, offering spiritual rituals to help insurgents avoid detection, help them be immune to the colonists' bullets, help them to just kind of be bound together in the process of a major uprising known as Tacky's Rebellion in Jamaica. The British really become terrified about African spiritual practices, promoting and supporting rebellion. And this is something that I think slave owners, colonial authorities throughout the Americas really focused on to varying degrees. And so in some parts of the Americas, we see direct prohibitions of African diaspora religions starting in this era, starting in the 18th and early 19th century. And then in some cases, like in the case of New Orleans, I think, they're using sometimes these laws about enslaved people gathering together or gathering together with free people, restrictions on assembly, the right to gather together that come in and lead to the arrest of so-called voodoo practitioners, right? But I think that probably the most important thing to understand in the history here of the persecution of African diaspora religions and its association with slavery is the Haitian Revolution. This is kind of this specter that looms large over everything that we're talking about with regard to African diaspora religions and with regard to the history of Black people in the Western Hemisphere, period, I think. So the Haitian Revolution, starting in 1791, is what a lot of scholars have referred to as the only successful slave rebellion in the Americas. And when they say that, they're using this metric of it is the only slave rebellion that actually led to the independence of all the rebels and the formation of the first free Black republic in the Americas. And the connection with African diaspora religions is that over time, legend has developed to say that the insurgents performed a Voodoo ceremony prior to the start of the rebellion, prior to the start of the revolution, and that they prayed to their spirits, their Loa, and asked them for assistance in the rebellion. They performed different rituals to help protect them in the rebellion. And then over time, when people would refer to Haiti, and even when we hear people talking about it today, they refer back to the importance of Vodou, and Vodou is a term that is a bit more respectful, not a bit more, a lot more respectful than the term voodoo, that devotees of Haitian Vodou will use to refer to their religion rather than voodoo. That devotees of Haitian Vodou played an important role in this uprising, and that the insurgents wouldn't have been empowered, wouldn't have felt protected enough to start this rebellion turned revolution, turned kind of 13-year war, right? That leads to the formation of Haiti, of the first free Black republic in the Americas. Unfortunately, sometimes when we hear outsiders refer to this, they're referring to things like, oh, the Haitians, they made a pact with the devil to gain their independence from France. There's this misunderstanding that the devotees of African diaspora religions, that they're worshiping the devil. And it's really an unfortunate misconception because these religions don't even have a concept of an ultimate evil, or at least I don't know of any African diaspora religion in the Americas that has a concept of an ultimate evil that is similar even to the Christian devil. But still, they're cast as, oh, the Haitians, they were worshiping the devil, and the devil helped free them from France, helped free them from slavery. And so, even though these religions played a really liberatory role, an important role in slave uprisings, they're really demonized by outsiders. And we can imagine why colonial authorities, slave owners, why they looked at these religions so unfavorably, right? They're losing their property as a part of these rebellions.
Yeah, there's a lot of overlap there, I think, between the ways in which the Haitian Revolution is understood and leads to misunderstanding, right, in other parts of the Americas and in the US, right? A lot of the problems we have with understanding the origins of voodoo in New Orleans revolve around the Haitian Revolution. So, as with Louisiana being the nearest French colony, where a lot of people from Saint-Domingue, slave owners, plantation owners, the nearest place where they would feel comfortable fleeing to, you get a huge outmigration of folks from Saint-Domingue to Louisiana. At one point in the early 19th century, the majority of the Black population in New Orleans is actually from Saint-Domingue. That's how many people are moved after the Haitian Revolution. Many of them, again, moved forcibly by plantation owners, by slave owners. That leads to a presumption, at least in part, in New Orleans, that what's going on religiously in New Orleans is the same thing as what's going on religiously in Saint-Domingue, right? And I think it's unproblematic to assume this huge Black population coming from Haiti has an influence on what's going on with Black folks on the ground in Louisiana. but I think it's more than presumptuous, right? And very involved. Uh, Racism is very important right here in that you presume that, oh, these folks are black and these folks are black, so they're all doing the same thing. It's all voodoo, right? It's all devil worship. It's all the same nonsense, right? It's anti-Christian. And I think that's problematic. And it leads to a defining of voodoo in the French colonial period and then stretching into the antebellum American period, right? That understands voodoo in this very limited way, again, defined by outsiders, defined by racism, as opposed to defined by practitioners and what they think they're doing, the way they classify their practices. You also end up with this problem that whereas the Caribbean, especially a place like Saint Domingue, is overwhelmingly black, right? The population, the black population far outstrips the white population. The in New Orleans, while New Orleans is a black city demographically, there's a demographic majority of black folks for much of New Orleans' history. It is also interracial and has a larger white population than you would expect in the Caribbean. And so that changes the nature of practice for black folks because now they're practicing voodoo in this interracial milieu where that interracial dynamic starts to define and redefine what voodoo is for practitioners. They understand, right, moving into the American period and then even further into the post-emancipation period, they understand that whiteness and power, whiteness and wealth are equated, right? And so they start to read that into their ritual practice. And so this kind of relationship between what are perceived as black practitioners and white practitioners, and then legal authority, which is perceived as overwhelmingly white. That interaction comes to define voodoo in the early 20th century, late 19th and early 20th centuries. So that relationship of I'm looking for an expert. I'm looking for somebody who does this kind of work. I'm looking for someone black, right? But then as a black practitioner, what you're thinking is, well, I want to be associated with wealth and power, so I need white clientele. And so this kind of odd relationship between race and religious practice, and then the law coming in to prosecute anybody who's doing any of these things that they see as inherently undesirable. That interaction comes to define voodoo by the time you get to the early 1900s.
And your work on that is so interesting, and it creates this incredible dichotomy between our two bodies of scholarship. I think one of the things that I look at in my most recent book, Voodoo: The History of a Racial Slur, is I look at where this term voodoo, as we know it, came about. The VOODOO that is our popular understanding of African diaspora religions today. And as I said before, I mean, we know that this root has its roots in Africa. It comes from a Dahomey Fawn term, meaning spirit. And then it's this term that the French give to all the religions in their colonies, all African religions in their colonies. And then, as you've spoken about, there's this perceived relationship between what's happening in Saint Domingue, which becomes Haiti after independence, and then New Orleans, as these are both French colonies, and there's this massive movement between them. But the thing that I find so fascinating about what you just said is that the French used a slightly different terminology. When we first start seeing the emergence of an anglicized term and we start seeing voodoo, VOODOO, used in US presses, it happens to coincide with the US Civil War. Prior to the Civil War, you would see the occasional reports of people being arrested for quote unquote voodoo. But these are really just reports that are confined to New Orleans, things that aren't getting a lot of public attention outside of the city, right? But the first time we start to see other people taking an interest in what's happening in New Orleans and this so called voodoo is after the Union forces take over New Orleans and emancipate the Black people living there. And then all of a sudden you see these reports throughout the Americas of, oh, look at these superstitious voodoo practices that are happening in New Orleans. This is what the rest of our country is going to look like if emancipation spreads, if the Union forces are successful in winning the Civil War. And so it is, as it's introduced to the country outside of New Orleans, it really becomes this marker of Blackness. And over the subsequent years, all we see are these reports in newspapers and books and pamphlets that start talking about voodoo. And it's very connected to what's referred to as original kind of African barbarism, this state that Black people will return to if separated from white civilizing forces. And so I found all of these newspapers that, as we have the post Civil War amendments to the Constitution, granting people, Black people citizenship and the right to vote, there are direct conversations about, well, I don't think Black people are really prepared for citizenship, are really prepared for the right to vote. And look at why. They're so superstitious. They have these voodoo practices. Look to New Orleans, and similar things are happening in other parts of the US South. And it's considered to be just this marker of a very African kind of superstition, barbarism that Black people are reverting to once they're freed from the civilizing force of slavery. And so I find it fascinating to then talk about and think about the importance that you're saying of whiteness and white people in voodoo practices in the United States.
Yeah, that speaks to one of the central problems I had when I started studying voodoo. So I think my presumption was that what I was doing was studying a Black religion, right? But then the earliest accounts that we have of voodoo come from things like newspapers that are covering arrests of voodoo practitioners. And whenever these arrests occurred, there are white folks present, right? And so then you have to untangle, well, what is the relationship between Blackness and whiteness and the law and voodoo, right? How are these things all helping to define one another? And what I found is that in the American period, in the mid to late 19th century, in that right around the Civil War, what you have is, again, fear of slave insurrection. And so breaking up any gatherings of Black people that are too large, especially gatherings that have free people and enslaved people at them. In the case of voodoo, when these gatherings are broken up, again, there are always white people there as well. By the time you move to the post-emancipation period and the early 20th century, especially, a lot of the reports about voodoo, again, are tied to arrests and prosecutions, but they change, right? There's this overlapping net of prosecutions that occur around voodoo. Again, Americans are less comfortable about prosecuting people for their religious practices. The Americans are less comfortable with that in the late 19th and early 20th century. But what you do see is these three different layers of prosecution. The most frequent thing you see are people being prosecuted for violating medical ordinances and doing healing work that is defined as illegal medicine, right? You're not a doctor, you're not qualified to do this. This is breaking the law. And the most prosecutions you see covered, at least by the news media in the early 20th century, revolve around that kind of thing at a time when, not surprisingly, the AMA is already trying to push out people, think like midwives, right, from practicing in this kind of space. And so prosecuting voodoo practice, it becomes a way to prosecute voodoo practitioners as well. You also have the federal government stepping in and prosecuting voodoo practitioners for violating laws against using the federal mail system in fraudulent ways, right? And so practitioners who are lending out their services frequently through a kind of mail order from New Orleans are prosecuted for violating fraud laws vis-a-vis the US mail, right? The last thing you have in New Orleans is this use of what they call the recorders courts, which are local. The closest analog would be something like small claims courts, right? Where prosecutions have relatively low stakes, and that their voodoo practitioners are prosecuted for violating laws against, again, mostly fraud laws, obtaining money under suspicious circumstances, right? Very nebulous charges like that. Mischief, illegal mischief, things that the police can kind of define for themselves when they decide to arrest you, right? And these things are prosecuted in the local recorders courts. If you look at all those things together, there's a clear attack on what is perceived as a Black religion by the law, but they're never defining it as an attack on religion. And so that it becomes difficult to understand, well, where does the religion start and stop? How does that govern our relationship to the law? What does all of this have to do with race and the way the race of the religious practitioners is perceived, and the way policing Black folks is very unproblematic for legal authorities in New Orleans at this period. And so it forces us to deal with voodoo specifically in the US. And I think, if I'm reading your work correctly, all these other African diaspora traditions in a way that is very complicated for both outsiders who might have a more interested, sympathetic eye toward these traditions, and other folks who are interested in demonizing them.
Absolutely. And I have so much to comment on that. But first, before we get into that, I wanted to ask if you could maybe clarify a little bit, what kinds of practices are we actually talking about that are being prosecuted here? So, how are we getting to this mail fraud type of case? What is this prosecution of people for fraudulent or unlawful medical practices? Could you explain a little bit more about that?
Sure, sure. So the a lot of what practitioners do in New Orleans revolves around healing rituals, right? People who have illnesses that they don't know exactly how to deal with, kind of prolonged health problems that they don't either have the money to go to traditional medical practitioners for, or don't have any confidence in those folks, right? And so they seek out these voodoo practitioners or perceived voodoo practitioners. So a lot of it is that sort of thing. And you have folks who are locally providing those kinds of services, healing services, and then also providing these things again through the mail. You also have practitioners, especially at the period that I study, people are overwhelmingly concerned with economics. By the time you get to the 1920s and 1930s, when the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, is gathering information by interviewing voodoo practitioners as part of what's called the Louisiana Writers Project, right? Where they send these writers out, they pay these writers to go out and do research. And they interview voodoo practitioners because they realize that this is something interesting going on the ground in Louisiana. By the time you get to that period and voodoo practitioners can kind of speak for themselves, it's also the Great Depression, which is why the WPA exists. And so they're overwhelmingly concerned with, do I have enough money? Can I pay my rent? Can I get a job? Can I keep the job that I have, right? And so voodoo practitioners also begin performing rites designed to help people get jobs, keep jobs, obtain money, right? There's also, given the money issue, there's also a lot of rites performed by voodoo practitioners locally around gambling, right? This will give you luck in gambling, because if you're desperate for money, not only are you willing to gamble, but you want some help doing that, right? So a lot of those things are economic. You also have folks performing rites and mixing rites, right? This, I think, is a lot of the appeal of African diaspora religions across the Western Hemisphere, right? There's a way in which, because you have a lack of centralized authority, that practitioners are in control of their own practice and can bend it to make it exactly what they need it to be. And in that respect, they begin using rites that you see them using earlier for things like maintaining a lover, and keeping your husband around or keeping your wife from cheating or any of those kinds of rights and using them on their bosses at work to maintain favor and keep your job, which suggests that, again, they're really concerned about work in this period. And so, whereas these rights might have been used for something different, now practitioners can bend them to do something else. And so, you see a lot of those different things, and all of those things are seemingly prosecutable given the arrest records and what the media is reporting on these things.
Yeah, I mean, it's really amazing how many consistencies we see across the Americas in terms of what kind of African spiritual practices were being prosecuted. And it's apparent to me, having studied the history of laws that come about prohibiting, quote unquote, pretending to practice witchcraft in England, and how these get distributed to the colonies, including what becomes the United States. And over time, we see an evolution of these laws. And they have a very big influence, especially post emancipation, on laws against African diaspora religions. And I would argue the kind of prosecutions that we see of voodoo practitioners in the United States. There's this understanding that certain, especially African derived, or things that are perceived to be African derived rituals, things to help people with all the things that you were talking about, with employment, with luck, with love, with kind of minor medical issues. All of these things end up characterized as a type of fraud, as a type of vagrancy. And this concept of vagrancy is really, really important throughout the Americas, especially in former British colonies, or what would have been, for the most part, British colonies at the time. And the US, up until the mid 20th century, even though it's no longer a British colony, it's still very much looking to what is happening in British law regarding vagrancy and fortune telling and these kinds of things. And so we see all of kind of the Anglophone world treating these unusual, non mainstream religious practices as a type of charlatanism. And in the case of people of African descent, prosecuting these individuals as vagrants also opens up a way to force people out of professions that, as you mentioned, might be something profitable, might be something independent, right? And to, in some cases, force them back to the very same plantations that they or their ancestors would have been enslaved on. And then something else that we haven't really talked about yet, that I think not only forms an important part of why African diaspora religions are prosecuted in the Americas, but also in understanding how we view them today, is this notion that devotees of these religions are practicing human sacrifice, that they're doing these terrible sorts of rituals as a part of their religious practice. These become rumors that create the justifications, if you will, that are used for the U.S. occupation of places like Cuba and Haiti. And these rumors really kind of follow devotees of African diaspora religions and get wrapped up into our understandings of them as time goes on. And I think one particularly interesting example that shows us how much there's this association, and I should mention a false association. We don't have any actual examples with evidence of where devotees would be doing any of these terrible things like human sacrifice, like cannibalism. We don't see any actual examples of this in history. A lot of it is based on this supposed eyewitness testimony where white people will go and they will say, oh, and I was invited to this voodoo ceremony. And while I didn't actually see them sacrifice a child, I knew that they were getting ready to do so because they were in such a frenzy, and such a frenzy could only be followed by human sacrifice, or something like that, or where people will claim that they heard from a friend of a friend who's a very reliable source who actually witnessed these practices. Um, And we just know that these things are very much wrapped up in a lot of racism and stereotypes about people of African descent. But then there's another kind of case that we see in the example that I'd like to bring up, which is um, a case that happened, I think it was 1934 in Detroit. And there was a group of Black Muslims growing in the city at the time. And this group of Black Muslims, there was one person named Robert Harris who was allegedly a member of the Black Muslim community. We don't really know for sure. We know that his brother was a Black Muslim, but we don't know the extent of his involvement. But he definitely struggled with mental illness, and he killed his tenant and referred to it as a sacrifice to Allah. And so all of a sudden throughout the United States, you see these reports about there's this voodoo cult of Black Muslims in Detroit. And ultimately, this becomes such a big problem as Robert Harris is put on trial for murder. He's ultimately sentenced to an asylum. But even though there's no basis for this, no foundation for this, he clearly was not a leader in the Black Muslim community, if he even actually belonged to it. All of the newspapers are saying, oh, there's this leader of this voodoo cult, and everybody is supporting him in his human sacrifice and all these kinds of things. And it becomes such a big deal that this organization becomes known as the Voodoo Cult of Detroit. Now, what is so fascinating about this example is that we know this organization. It becomes the Nation of Islam. And part of the reason why the Nation of Islam gets renamed. It was formerly when they were in Detroit, there was something like the Allah Temple of Islam or something like that, and they changed leaders because their original leader is taken in by the police and is accused of promoting human sacrifice, and then they changed locations from Detroit to Chicago, and they changed their name all purportedly because of they're trying to escape this reputation as the voodoo cult of Detroit. And so, in looking at kind of the foundations of the Nation of Islam and this terrible reputation that they get from the actions of one insane individual who may or may not have even been affiliated with this community at all, we can understand how the reputation about voodoo could impact different communities and how much it's wrapped up in these stereotypes about people doing these terrible things. By the time we get to the 20th century. And I think this is also really important to understand that these kind of rumors, this understanding of African diaspora religions as not just a harmless superstition, not just these actual prosecutions that we're seeing of cases of fraud, of kind of practicing medicine without a license and that kind of thing, but also these rumors about human sacrifice and cannibalism. They're part of what fuel a really widespread, really intense prosecution and persecution of these communities throughout the Americas. In places like Brazil and Cuba, we see police just raiding temples of African diaspora religions. They're arresting devotees. They're uh, taking sacred artifacts and they're burning them in the streets. In some cases, they're pretty much destroying entire communities. And this is also something that the US occupying forces, when the US occupied Haiti from 1915 to 1934, this is something that the Marines were doing as well. They're arresting people for practicing voodoo, and they're seizing their artifacts, some of which we see in naval museums today. And in fact, if anybody ever visits a museum and sees artifacts about African diaspora religions, there's a fair chance that they were probably seized during these raids, this violent period in the early 20th century of widespread suppression on these religions.
Yeah, that brings up a really interesting point, right, about the ways in which the law influences religious practice, right? And the fear of prosecution. In New Orleans, what you get, I talk about two different models of voodoo, right? Especially by the time you get to the early 20th century. The first is the Marie Laveau model. Marie Laveau is the mytho-historic voodoo queen that is so important to establishing the way voodoo is practiced in New Orleans in the 19th and 20th centuries. And she's looked at as someone who's intimately tied to powerful folks in the city. She's frequently defined as racially ambiguous or biracial, or terms that they use in Louisiana, quadroon, which is to say 1/4 black, or octoroon, 1/8 black, which reads her into the kind of racial history of New Orleans. She's also thought to have done most of her practice in secret at home, right, for important clientele. That model is then added to in the early 20th century by what I call the Leafy Anderson model. Anderson is actually the progenitor of what we call a spiritual church in New Orleans, right? New Orleans is a very confusing religious space, in that you also have in the 19th century French spiritualism, which is frequently prosecuted in connection with fortune telling, with mediumship, with magnetic healing, they call it, which are all those things are all prosecutable by the time you get to the end of the 19th century, and very much of European origin, even though they're used to prosecute Black voodoo practitioners, but very much of French origin, and brought over by French Creole speakers. But the Leafy Anderson model is actually designed to get around a lot of those kinds of prosecution. Leafy Anderson is a woman who moves to New Orleans from Chicago at the beginning of the 20th century and founds not a spiritualist church, but a spiritual church, which is akin to these storefront churches that are formed in Chicago. She moves to New Orleans, she builds her own church, and of course, she's arrested twice, about 4 years apart, and prosecuted in connection with her spiritual church. And so she starts to develop ways to get around these legal persecutions that define the way spiritual churches look in New Orleans going forward. Her success in building a church that is, at least in the view of practitioners, less likely to run afoul of the law, also leads voodoo practitioners to then found their own spiritual churches, or people, we should say, people who are prosecuted for practicing voodoo then found spiritual churches, right? Because they're not defining their practice for themselves as voodoo. They're not defining it as spiritualism. They're very comfortable with the gray area. Again, I think largely because of fear of the law. And then the Leafy Anderson spiritual church model starts to proliferate again across New Orleans, where you actually practice in public, you have the infrastructure of a church, and you practice in a church, right? And that way you can do all the things that people would demonize or criminalize as voodoo, but in this church that is thought of as a protected space in the American sphere. And actually leads to some of the spiritual churches being granted tax exempt status by the state of Louisiana, which is viewed by practitioners as the ultimate form of legitimacy, right? And so what you have is the law redefining spiritual practice because of the criminalization of practitioners.
Yeah, I think you're bringing up something really important here that I meant to mention a bit earlier, which is the role of spiritualism in this whole kind of I would say Atlantic world process of prosecuting folks in the late 19th and early 20th century. And so we see the rise of this concept of spiritualism, which centers a lot on mediumship, on what is often referred to as conjuring spirits, on talking to departed persons to gain more information about what's happening in our world, right? And these individuals are prosecuted alongside often devotees of Africana religions in the 19th and early 20th centuries, as being types of frauds. So, in this period, I would say that there's something that just there's this broad trend to view people who claim to be able to divine things, people who claim to be able to communicate with spirits, as being frauds, as being vagrants, as obtaining money through charlatanism, right? But something really interesting that I think we need to bring up that happens in the mid 20th century is a break in our understandings of things, which I think coincides with what you're talking about these efforts to seek legitimacy through this tax exempt status. Is that people who have this kind of spiritualism, they seek legitimacy through the law, right? There's this effort to say, no, we are real religious practitioners, and we deserve to be recognized, and we're going to fight against these efforts to criminalize what we're doing, and we're going to fight against anybody who is describing us as frauds. And what we see is a lot of cases, a lot of really important cases coming down in, again, kind of the Anglophone Atlantic world, in the UK itself, in the US, in the, I believe, 1940s, US v. Ballard, or Ballard v. US. I don't remember which way it came up. But essentially, where the courts are asked to talk about these spiritualist practices or spiritualist type of practices, they're asked to determine whether people can still be prosecuted for doing things like conjuring spirits and performing divination, whether this kind of spiritual fraud prosecution is legitimate, or does it perhaps infringe on religious freedom. And what we see by the 1940s and 50s is that by and large, courts are saying this is infringing on religious freedom. Part of this is a understanding that religions don't have to be mainstream, they don't have to be understandable to mainstream society. They can look like something idiotic to outsiders, but um, the law, prosecutors, police, and judges, they don't have the right to judge people, to judge religious beliefs as legitimate or not. And the reason that I bring this up is because there is a really kind of bizarre um, break that happens where the people who look a little more Western in what they're doing, who are establishing official churches and coming out in the public and using the law to fight for their rights, and people who are a little more associated with spiritualism, spiritism, um, they gain a certain level of legitimacy. Whereas we see, for instance, in the former British Caribbean, uh, obia remains today in the 21st century prohibited in about a dozen countries. And so I'd argue here that we see the roots of a trend that is really problematic today, where white practitioners, or practitioners of religions that are perceived to have their roots in Europe, like Spiritism, like Wicca, like self described witches, that these individuals are able to gain a kind of legal legitimacy that devotees of African and African diaspora religions are still unable to obtain.
That's interesting, right? I think necessarily, right, because the relationship between law enforcement and the practitioners of African diaspora religions has been so hostile. We necessarily keep coming back to these prosecutions, right? But there's a moment in the late 20th century in Florida, right, with the Church of the Babalui in Hialeah, where it looks like the Supreme Court is actually going to defend African diaspora religious practitioners, but the prosecution is brought by these ostensibly white Cubans, right? Talk to me some more about that. Your work does such a good job of unpacking all of that. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, this case is really fascinating, and the racial dynamics of it alone, as you mentioned, are really important to, I think, our understanding of African diaspora religious freedom in more recent contexts. So the Church of the Lucumí Babaluaye v. City of Hialeah is a case that is probably one of the most important cases in the history of free exercise cases in the United States. So the influx of Cubans into the United States mostly comes in the early 1960s following the Cuban Revolution, right? And what scholars have documented is that of the hundreds of thousands, really millions of people who end up coming to the United States, the early wave of Cubans is predominantly white. And this is probably for a number of reasons that I don't want to get myself in trouble by speculating too much about. But one of the easiest things that we can say is that because the Cuban Revolution is about the state kind of seizing a lot of property from Cubans, and so you have this particular population of Cubans in the United States who are not only white, but they're also perceived as kind of being political refugees. They're seen as very different from other immigrants at the time. But all of this starts to change by the 1980s. We're seeing an influx of Cubans who are more racially diverse. And we also, at the same time, have an influx of Haitian immigrants into especially South Florida and New York, the same places that Cuban immigrants are going. And so there's this big concern about, will Cuban immigrants be able to retain the same perception that they've had in for the American public up to this point in the first 20 years or so of immigration? You have the Church of the Lucumí Babaluaye, which is a community of Century Lucumí devotees who decide that they want to establish an open official church and cultural center in the city of Hialeah, which is a predominantly Cuban area of Florida in Miami-Dade County. And so immediately, because this group of people they're talking about trying to establish an Afro-Cuban religious community, a church in a predominantly Cuban area. There's discussion about how can we stop this from happening. And in part, scholars have talked about that this is concern about race, and will this make people start to see Cubans as being not entirely white. And so the city of Hialeah, they have this, the city council has this emergency meeting. And during the meeting, people are openly stating things like, how do we stop the church from opening? What can we do to keep these devil worshippers out of our community? And ultimately, what they decide upon is to pass a series of ordinances that restrict the practice of animal sacrifice. And animal sacrifice is a practice that is central to a number of religions in the African diaspora. And then after the sacrifice, which is performed by people who are very knowledgeable, who have been very well trained in the religion, one can think of it as being very similar to the way that people are trained to do kosher and halal slaughter, to kill an animal in such a way to make it clean for human consumption. People who are conducting animal sacrifice in African diaspora religions are at least as well trained. And so then after the sacrifice is performed, typically the community will cook and use the meat. They might also use the skin of the animals, the feathers for various things. Typically, as much as possible, the entire animal is used. Despite all this, and probably honestly not really knowing any of this information or caring to know any of this information, there was this perception, or at least the city council gave this description in its defense of its laws against animal sacrifice, claiming that what they were concerned about was that the church would be polluting their city by establishing this official site, that animal sacrifice would lead to rodents coming around and bloodborne diseases and that children would be traumatized by witnessing the death of an animal and all these kinds of things. So the Church of the Lucumí Babluaye sues over these city ordinances, and the case weaves its way up all the way to the US Supreme Court. And the US Supreme Court ultimately says that you can't pass a law that intentionally discriminates against a religious community and then expect that law to hold up as something that's more important than religious practice. And so the Supreme Court carves out this exception to the typical trend in free exercise cases at the time and says, look, you can't intentionally discriminate against religion. And so that is seen as a big victory by devotees of African diaspora religions in the US. It's solidifying that these are religions, in this case, that Century Lucumí is a religion, that they are protected by First Amendment rights, and that you can't intentionally discriminate against them. But there's a lot of other things going on here. I mean, first of all, I think that what you mentioned about the white practitioners is a very interesting element of this. And this clearly goes back to even what you were speaking about with the people who are being arrested for voodoo practices and the racial dynamics of voodoo, I mean, dating all the way back to the 19th century at least, that we often see white practitioners and that there's a trend among some communities to try to gain legal legitimacy through the law, and that this is something that's kind of associated with whiteness, if you will. And I think that this case, as you already mentioned, is really interesting because it is brought by Cubans of European descent, white presenting Cubans, and people who, I mean, my understanding is, are describing themselves as being white, but they're defending the right to practice an African diaspora religion. And up until this point, and I would also say after this point, something interesting that we see in the courts in the US is that a lot of times when we are talking about um, African diaspora religious freedom, the cases are being brought by people who are, if not fully of European descent, at least predominantly of European descent. And a lot of times the courts are not looking so favorably on these kinds of cases. When we see the first cases that are coming out, for instance, about the right of Rastafarians to use marijuana as a sacrament, it's brought by white converts to Rastafari, right? Who are moving large amounts of marijuana from Jamaica to the United States. And I think the decisions about this have a lot of um, relationship to the perception that maybe this is something that we don't want white people to be doing. And I think we can talk about dating back to the 19th century. Um, People are very concerned about white folks being corrupted by Black religions, right? And something that has always stood out to me is that in the first case that the US Supreme Court hears about free exercise of religion and what exactly that means in US v. Reynolds, it's a case about Mormons and their practices of polygamy. And so what you have is a group of white folks who are practicing polygamy. And there's this line in the Supreme Court decision that says something to the effect of, well, this is stuff that Europeans, that white folks really shouldn't be doing. These are practices of Africans and Asians. And so I've always thought about that in the broader context of what we see of white practitioners of Afro-diasporic religions being so visible in the fight over legal legitimacy. I've always thought about that as being something that maybe the courts are a bit leery about. Like, well, I mean, there's this hope that whiteness can give um, legitimacy to these religions, but there's also this tendency of society and the courts to maybe worry about, well, are Black people leading white people astray here? And, in this case, in Reynolds, it's, well, I mean, white people don't really do polygamy. That's not something that we want to support. And so I think the city of Hialeah case is a bit interesting in that it doesn't follow that norm where the courts would typically find against a group of white practitioners of an Afro-diasporic religion, but it does follow the trend in the sense that um, not all people felt like what the church was doing in bringing this lawsuit in the first place, or in trying to establish this public church in the first place. That these, not all people felt like this was an appropriate practice. Not all devotees were in support of that. And over the years, some people have said, well, maybe that's a very Western way of looking at Century Lucumí. This is something that is supposed to be private. It's supposed to be secret. And by trying to establish a church in the first place, that this is a very Western way of going about things. And that maybe all of this litigation was bringing the religion to light in a way that we didn't want to see happen. So there's so many interesting things happening in the racial dynamics and racial makeups of the right to practice Afro-diasporic religions that I think your work demonstrates dates back much earlier than anything that I've really focused on in my work.
Yeah, there's a very interesting the those cases and the relationship to South Florida brings up very interesting parallels in New Orleans, right? In the 1930s, you have this moment when I think, given the way the pharmaceutical industry in the 21st century has been privy to so many lawsuits, it's ironic, right? But you have these white owners of pharmacies who sell voodoo related paraphernalia, right? And the presumption is you have Black folks who are prosecuted for selling similar paraphernalia through the mail. But you have pharmacists who are overwhelmingly white selling this stuff on the ground in New Orleans, right? Now, they don't advertise that they're selling it, but if you ask for it, if you walk into a pharmacy and ask for it, they'll provide you with this stuff, right? And so there's this notion that being a pharmacist and being white is an effective cover from the kind of legal persecution that voodoo practitioners are enduring for selling the same kinds of materials through the US mail, right? But the understanding is still that there's a relationship between Blackness and the practice of these religions that legitimizes them, right? So we also have practitioners on the ground where there's a pair who operates in New Orleans, not far from what is today the French Quarter, right? A Black woman and a white woman who operate together and who tell interviewers from the WPA, they say explicitly to them, well, she's here because she can bring in white clientele, right? Which speaks to affluence and money and availability. But her mentor is a Black woman, right? Who's perceived to have taught her all these skills, right? And so there's a relationship between race and legitimacy that leans towards Blackness in the eyes of practitioners and people soliciting services. But there's a relationship between race and legitimacy vis-a-vis the law that leans towards whiteness in New Orleans in the early 20th century. And there's a way in which what's going on in the 21st century is trying to reorient the relationship between race and law and legitimacy in the context of this religious practice that is, again, very uncomfortable, I think, for some of the religious practitioners, right? Who is deciding what is legitimate? Does Blackness necessarily make the practice less legitimate in the eyes of the law? And those kinds of things. That is a very disconcerting tangle. Whereas by the time you get to the late 20th century, what you see in New Orleans is practitioners going out of their way to re-Africanize their practices, right? Where you have practitioners, priestesses especially, who travel to West Africa in order to be reinitiated in faiths that they discovered here in New Orleans, right? Or practitioners who have godparents who are Haitian priestesses in order to legitimize, especially among white practitioners in New Orleans who go to Haitian practitioners in order to be initiated so that they can be seen as more legitimate because Blackness and legitimacy in the face of the religion are seen as being synonymous. And in the late 20th century, in the early 21st century, those things are less legally problematic because you have these white, well, at least in part, because you have these white folks who are practicing in the city.
I think that it's important to bring up that in a lot of cases in the present day, there are a number of white devotees of African diaspora religions, and this doesn't necessarily get rid of the stigma or make these religions be seen as any more legitimate, despite whatever people may believe is going to happen internally within their communities, whatever the politics of having white initiates might be. There's still discrimination and violence against these religious communities. And I mean, we can see this a little bit in the case of the Church of the Lucumí Babaluaye, the city of Hialeah. I mean, as I mentioned, the fact that these are white devotees, it doesn't keep the city of Hialeah from going, hey, we need to stop these practices. How can we get rid of them? Today, the religious landscape, it looks really different throughout the Americas. As I've said previously, there are existing laws against obeah in many places in the former British Caribbean. Um, we don't have any strict laws like that in the United States that would prohibit voodoo or any other Afro-diasporic religion. And practitioners of Afro-diasporic religions oftentimes see themselves as being a bit protected or insulated by the Church of the Lucumí Babaluaye case. However, what I'm seeing in practice is that people remain persecuted, remain restricted in certain practices. We are still seeing devotees of Africana religions in the US, mostly in private homes. And so if someone is hosting a ceremony and say they're having singing and drumming, or they're just having a lot of people at their home, neighbors will often call the police. And in some cases, it's under the guise of noise pollution. In some cases, they're raising concerns still about animal sacrifice. In some cases, they're just calling and saying, hey, there's a lot of people coming and going from this home. I don't know what's going on over here. You need to send the authorities. And the thing is that the police frequently come in as if they're cracking down on some terrorist plot or something like that. They're coming in with sometimes like a dozen officers or something like that, multiple police cars coming up and just storming a residence. And they're often coming in guns drawn, holding devotees at gunpoint while they interrogate what's going on. They're interrupting and sometimes entirely ceasing important processes that have probably spent months of preparation, and a lot of money has gone into uh, obtaining all the stuff that you need for different ceremonies and things. And they're treating people like they're dangerous criminals. And then sometimes they're also giving them mixed information about what they can or cannot do, telling them like, oh, I don't think that animal sacrifice is allowed here, or you've got too many people here, when really legal local ordinances would not prohibit a gathering of that size, or just things of that nature. There's a lot of discriminatory kinds of surveillance of practices that are happening. You also see a lot of family custody disputes. There's still this sense that uh, animal sacrifice in particular, but these religions, Afro-diasporic religions generally, are a threat to child welfare. And there's even a case coming out of New Jersey fairly recently, about 10 years ago, I believe, where a woman was initiating her daughter into an Afro-Cuban religion, and the child went through a process that happens in some religions where they make very light incisions on the body, and then they also perform at least one animal sacrifice. And the woman, as well as the priest who performed the rituals, were charged with child endangering, felony child endangering. Um, and the woman lost custody temporarily of her daughter, her 7-year-old daughter, who was undergoing the initiation. And the basic gist of the situation is that she only got custody of her daughter returned to her after everybody involved said essentially that they were no longer affiliated with this religion. And one might assume that practices like circumcision, which is essentially, at least originates from a religious practice, right? And is still a very religious practice in some communities, that things like circumcision would prevent the courts from saying, hey, this is a religious practice that is protected by the First Amendment. And then we have this Supreme Court case that says that you can't directly discriminate against like animal sacrifice. It is a religious practice, but there's something particular, and perhaps I should say peculiar, happening with cases about Afro-diasporic religions today, that courts are carving out distinctions about these cases. And in this case, the appellate courts in New Jersey were finding that that this was a danger to a child, that witnessing an animal sacrifice, and I mean, to me, I say to myself, well, I mean, what about all the hunters? What about all the farmers? What about all these folks out here who are killing animals for sport? I bet they're not being prosecuted for child endangering. I bet they haven't had custody of their children removed. But the courts were depicting this as something that seemed very sinister, and definitely weren't buying into the religious freedom arguments in this particular case. I think that this is where we come back to these conversations that we've been having all this time about, well, these religions aren't quite seen the same way as other religions. They're not quite granted the same protections as other religions. And a lot of this is just minimal knowledge about them. It is persistent biases that date back to slavery, that date back to post-emancipation arguments about the inferiority of Black people, and are fueled by the movies that we see today, the television shows that talk about voodoo and vodou. Um, so we've got a lot working against devotees today, and we see a lot of different ways in which their rights are still limited. They're still dealing with employment disputes where some people have been fired for sometimes just being affiliated with a particular religion, and the employer finds out and thinks that they're doing something bad, some devil worship or something, and so they find reasons to fire them or harass them until they leave their job. Not being allowed to wear religious attire or take breaks needed for initiations or that kind of thing. Like I said, child custody disputes, harassment at ceremonies. There's a lot going on. And I would say that a lot of this is um, pretty overlooked, especially in the scholarship and discussions about religious freedom in the United States. So, Dr. Roberts, we've all been asked to close out our sessions with one final question, and that is, what is your hope for the future of religious liberty?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I think that there are scholars of religion and law that have really brought into question whether or not the US courts can, maybe specifically the US Supreme Court, is in a position to do this particularly well, right? To protect people's religious practices. The way this generally works is that the court has to decide what is or is not a legitimate religion. and then decide whether or not the perceived protections for religious practices apply to a specific group or people, right? But especially when those traditions are connected to people of African descent, right? They tend to be, or maybe it's more broadly, any ethnic minority. They tend to be less forgiving, right? When deciding what becomes a religion, what is considered a religion, and what is protected by the courts. So I think there's an argument to be made, a rather convincing one, that maybe we should get out of the business of the US courts defining religion at all.
I think that my hopes, my thoughts about the future of religious liberty, they are specifically focused on African diaspora religions. I think the extent to which these religions continue to be persecuted is largely overlooked, is really not very well understood. This problem is pretty widespread. For instance, a bunch of at least 45 Voodoo practitioners were murdered in Haiti after the 2010 earthquake and cholera outbreak, um, because they were blamed for the cholera outbreak. They were blamed for having these sinister practices, right? And a lot of the stereotypes of them is rooted in this history um, of racialization that we've been talking about during our conversation today. I think that there's little knowledge about the discrimination and violence. And even when people do hear about it, I fear that the biases against these religious communities are so strong that people don't necessarily care. They don't necessarily see that as being a problem. So, something that I'm still trying to work through, but a forthcoming research project is surrounding public perceptions of African diaspora religions. And my colleagues and I just conducted a survey of 1,280 people. And one of the questions that we asked them is that we gave them a question bank, an answer bank of different religions. And we asked, which of these do you view as a religion? And African diaspora religions were ranked dead last in an answer bank that included, of course, the big three: Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, but also Hinduism and Satanism. And African diaspora religions, specifically, we asked about Santeria and we asked about um, Voodoo. And these were ranked last in terms of the religions that people viewed as being religions. And so my hope for the future of religious liberty is that, first of all, that we can push back against the biases, against the discrimination that is still so pervasive, and manage to get to a point, a space where we can see that these biases are really associated with a history of slavery, colonialism, and racism, that we can have a system of policing and courts that will uphold the practice of these religions, that will protect it and insulate people from discrimination and violence rather than being sources of it themselves. I've really enjoyed our conversation today. Thank you, Dr. Roberts, for being here, and thank you, everyone, for listening.